I remember that night like it was yesterday, though years have passed. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. I was standing by the window in our living room, the warm glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the carpet, when she slipped into the room behind me. My sister-in-law, who I had welcomed into our home with open arms, leaned in close and whispered something that would change everything. At first, I didn't fully register her words. I thought I had misheard, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the trembling in her voice, the cold certainty in her eyes made it impossible to ignore. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my chest, a mixture of disbelief, fear, and a sudden aching sense of betrayal. It's strange how someone you trust can quietly dismantle your sense of safety. When I agreed to let her move in, I thought I was doing a good thing. She had been struggling, a job loss, a messy divorce, and I believed family should be there for one another. I had always prided myself on compassion, on keeping our home a place of warmth and refuge. But I didn't realize that sometimes the people you open your doors to are not the people you think they are. Before everything changed, life had a comforting rhythm. My husband David was a good man. At least that's what I believed. We had been married for 12 years, sharing mornings over coffee with the soft smell of cinnamon toast, evenings listening to the distant hum of traffic outside our bedroom window. Our children, Emma and little Leo, brought chaos and joy in equal measure, leaving a trail of toys across the living room carpet and endless sticky handprints on the fridge. David worked long hours as an accountant, meticulous and quiet, but affectionate in small, meaningful ways. He would leave little notes for me in the mornings. "Don't forget your lunch," or "I love you," tucked between the pages of my planner. I cherished those small gestures. They felt like invisible threads tying us together, even on days when life felt heavy. And then there was her, my sister-in-law, Grace. At first, she was the perfect guest. Polite, cheerful, helping out around the house. She would bake cookies with Emma, read bedtime stories to Leo, and offer to run errands when I was swamped. I told myself I was lucky to have her, a family member who actually seemed to care. But subtle things began to shift, almost imperceptibly. A door left slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed it. A lingering glance between her and David that made my stomach twist. A quiet laugh, just a little too intimate, that didn't feel like sister-in-law laughter. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, I had nothing to fear. My marriage was strong, wasn't it? I should have listened to the small, insistent whispers in my own mind. I should have trusted the little knot of unease I felt whenever I saw them together. But hope is a powerful thing. Hope can blind you. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that I was just imagining shadows in the corners of my mind. It was during one of those ordinary evenings, the kind where the house smells faintly of roasted chicken and the children are tucked into bed, that I noticed the first clue. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when I saw Grace slipping a folded piece of paper into David's briefcase. I froze mid-motion, my hand lingering on the counter, pretending not to watch. My heart began to race, and I told myself firmly, "Don't jump to conclusions. Don't let paranoia take over." But the unease settled like a stone in my chest. Later that night, when David and Grace were in the living room watching a movie, I caught snippets of their conversation. Laughter. Soft, conspiratorial, and tinged with a familiarity that made my skin prickle. I could hear my own name, though it was not spoken with love or concern, only in passing, like I was a footnote in a story that didn't include me. Still, I convinced myself I was being silly. Perhaps it was just the stress of work, the overwhelming routine of managing a household. Perhaps I was seeing patterns where there were none. But deep down, a tiny, persistent voice whispered, "Something is off." Then came the night of the whisper. I was folding laundry in the dim light of our bedroom when Grace slipped in. She didn't knock. She didn't say hello. Her eyes were intense, almost desperate, and her voice was barely audible. "I can't keep it a secret anymore," she said, leaning close. "David, he's been lying to you. I didn't want you to know this way." I froze, my hands gripping the edges of the shirt I was folding. The words caught in my throat, impossible to swallow. She paused, searching my face for a reaction, and I realized she wasn't looking at me like a sister-in-law. She was looking at me like a conspirator, a co-guardian of some dark truth I had no idea existed. It was then that I heard it. The confession that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my marriage. And in that moment, I felt my world tilt. A dizzying, nauseating sense that everything I had built my life around was quietly, insidiously crumbling. I don't want to tell you what she said just yet. Not because it's unimportant, but because the weight of it cannot be rushed. The truth of betrayal, when it seeps in quietly, spreads like a shadow. Slow, suffocating, inescapable. That whisper marked the beginning of a journey I could never have anticipated. A path filled with doubt, heartbreak, and the painstaking search for clarity. I stood there in the laundry room, the fabric of the shirt crumpled in my hands, listening to the faint sounds of their laughter through the wall. And in that moment, I knew that my life, my marriage, my home, the very foundation of trust I had built, would never be the same again. After that night, the house never felt quite the same. I tried to hold on to routine. The breakfast chaos, the smell of coffee brewing in the morning, the soft hum of the dishwasher at night. But everything seemed sharper somehow. Every laugh, every touch, every glance between David and Grace carried a shadow I couldn't ignore. In the days before the whisper, life had been predictable, comforting in its small rhythms. I would wake early, the sunlight spilling through our bedroom curtains, and make breakfast for the kids. Scrambled eggs with a sprinkle of cheese, toast lightly buttered and steaming. David would shuffle into the kitchen, hair mussed, eyes half closed, and kiss my forehead before helping Emma with her math homework or Leo with his puzzles. We'd laugh at his awful jokes, the ones that never quite landed, and I'd feel that familiar warmth, the quiet anchor of family life. Grace had moved in during a particularly stressful period for her. She had lost her apartment after a messy breakup, and I had immediately thought it was my duty to help her. After all, family is family. I told David, "It's just temporary. She'll have a place of her own soon." And he agreed, though there was the faintest hesitation in his eyes, a flicker I didn't recognize at the time. The first few weeks were almost idyllic. Grace was helpful, cheerful, and seemed genuinely appreciative. She'd wake early to make breakfast with me, chatting about little things. Work frustrations, memories from our childhood, even gossip from distant relatives. I was grateful for the company. The house felt lighter with her there. Emma adored her, and even little Leo would run to her when he saw her in the mornings, giggling uncontrollably. But as the days turned into weeks, subtle things began to change. The first clue was almost laughable in hindsight, but at the time it was a pinprick of unease I couldn't quite ignore. I noticed that David would sometimes retreat to the office for no apparent reason, closing the door just a fraction too quickly when I approached. When I asked about it, he shrugged and muttered something about work stress. Then there were the little absences. Grace would leave the house for errands and return hours later, claiming she had run simple tasks, grocery shopping, mailing packages. But when I asked for details, her answers felt vague, almost rehearsed. It made me pause, but I tried not to read too much into it. Maybe I'm just tired, I told myself. Maybe I'm imagining tension where there isn't any. I began noticing how she and David interacted too. Small gestures at first. A laugh shared a heartbeat too long. A casual brush of hands when passing in the hallway. Things I might have overlooked if I hadn't been hyper-aware since her move-in. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence or familiarity. After all, they were siblings. But something in me felt unsettled. The next clue came during a casual dinner. We were all at the table, Emma complaining about school homework and Leo trying to sneak peas onto the floor. Grace and David were talking quietly, leaning slightly toward each other. I caught a fragment of conversation. Nothing outright, just murmurs. But it was enough to make my stomach twist. "Did you see the email?" she asked softly. David chuckled, nodding, leaning closer. "Yeah, I got it. Don't worry. The tone, the intimacy, the secrecy. It was like a thread unraveling quietly in the background of my life. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just ordinary family chatter. But the knot of unease in my chest grew tighter. That night, I lay awake listening to the quiet creaks of the house, the distant hum of the heater replaying every interaction, every look, every laugh that felt slightly off. By this time, I had started noticing other signs, smaller and subtler, but impossible to ignore once your mind is tuned to suspicion. The way my husband's phone would slip into his pocket whenever I entered a room. The sudden, almost defensive need to finish some work emails late at night. The way Grace would sometimes linger near him during family photos, her hand brushing his shoulder just a beat too long. I found myself walking on eggshells, trying not to show the anxiety gnawing at me, trying to maintain the warmth of our home while a quiet storm brewed beneath the surface. I would watch from the doorway as David and Grace interacted, forcing myself to breathe deeply and tell myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. My instincts rarely lie. Then came the turning point. A small, seemingly innocuous detail that would later feel like a glaring warning sign. I was putting away laundry one evening when I found a receipt tucked into the pocket of David's jacket. A fancy restaurant I didn't recognize, a date he hadn't mentioned. I stared at it, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it's a business lunch. Maybe it's nothing. But deep down, I knew the truth was waiting just beyond my reach. A week later, another small clue surfaced. Grace had borrowed my car for a day, she said, to run errands. When she returned, I noticed something odd, a tiny folded note sticking out of her bag. I didn't read it at first, but curiosity gnawed at me. Later, when I unfolded it in the quiet of the laundry room, my hands trembling, the words inside were benign on the surface. But the tone, the phrasing, the way she referenced David with a familiarity that wasn't hers, it made my stomach drop. I realized then that my initial unease wasn't paranoia. Something was happening. Something quiet, hidden and dangerous. The home I had built, the life I had nurtured was quietly being invaded from within. I didn't yet know the full extent, but the whispers of betrayal were growing louder. And yet I clung to hope. Hope that it was a misunderstanding. Hope that the small anomalies could be explained away. Hope, in that moment, was the only thing keeping me sane. But deep inside, a gnawing fear had taken root, one that I couldn't shake. And it would not let me. It was a Friday evening, the kind that normally felt ordinary and comforting. The kids were at a friend's birthday party. David was home from work early, and Grace had offered to make dinner, something about trying a new recipe she had found online. I should have felt relief, even gratitude. Instead, I felt the familiar tight knot of unease in my chest. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when I heard David and Grace laughing softly in the living room. Not the gentle, ordinary family laughter I was used to, but a shared, secretive kind of laughter that prickled my skin. My hands trembled slightly, not from the knife, but from the dread that had begun to build over the past few weeks. I tried to shake it off. I'm imagining it, I told myself. I need to trust him. I need to trust her. Their family. But then the first concrete clue appeared. Grace, in that casual way that now seemed rehearsed, slipped a small envelope into David's jacket pocket. I froze mid-chop, staring at the simple beige paper. It was unassuming. Too unassuming. But I recognized the deliberate secrecy of the act. I waited until dinner was finished, my heart hammering, before quietly confronting David. "David, what's this?" I asked, holding up his jacket. He glanced down at it, startled, and for a moment I saw hesitation flicker in his eyes. It's nothing. Just some mail that slipped into my pocket." "Mail?" I repeated, my voice calm but steady, my pulse racing beneath the surface. "From Grace?" He looked away, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated." I felt my chest tighten. Complicated? How complicated could an envelope be? But before I could press further, the sound of footsteps startled me. Grace was behind him, smiling that soft, almost innocent smile that I had once trusted. Oh, I just dropped it off, she said lightly. Nothing important. And yet, I knew better. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed and the house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, I confronted Grace alone. I saw you, I said quietly, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. I saw you give David that envelope. What is going on? Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of guilt, but then her expression softened into something almost casual. It's just something I found out, she said. Something you deserve to know, but maybe weren't ready for. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. He's been hiding things from you. Big things. Things that you wouldn't understand until now. The words fell like stones into my chest. I wanted to step back, to dismiss them, to tell myself it was manipulation, paranoia, imagination. But the weight in her voice, the intensity in her eyes made it impossible to ignore. I spent the next few days piecing things together, following small trails of evidence that had seemed insignificant before. Receipts, unexplained absences, the little glances, the hushed conversations. The picture that emerged was worse than I could have imagined. My husband, the man I had trusted with my heart, with our children, with our home, was not the man I thought he was. One night, I found David's phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. Normally, I would have never touched it. Trust is not something you break lightly. But desperation overrode my restraint, and there it was. Messages, emails, fragments of conversations that confirmed what Grace had whispered. Not just small lies, not just hidden expenses, but a secret relationship that had been simmering quietly for months, perhaps years. I felt my knees go weak, the world tilting as the full weight of betrayal hit me. I sat on the kitchen floor, phone in hand, staring blankly at the stream of evidence that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Tears slipped silently down my cheeks, not because I wanted to cry, but because my body needed an outlet for the raw shock and heartbreak that had no words. When David came into the kitchen moments later, I didn't speak. I just held up the phone. The look on his face, a mix of guilt, fear, and frustration, told me everything I needed to know. I didn't mean for you to find out this way, he muttered, avoiding my eyes. Find out this way? I repeated, voice trembling but steady. David, this isn't a small mistake. This isn't a slip-up. You've been hiding her from me for months. From our children, from our life, he tried to speak, to explain. But the words sounded hollow, meaningless against the mountain of evidence before us. My heart ached, a physical pain, as I realized that the person I had trusted more than anyone in the world had chosen deception over honesty. That was when Grace walked in, almost casually, as if she belonged there, as if she hadn't just helped dismantle the foundation of my life. She didn't apologize. She didn't flinch. Instead, she gave me a small, tight smile, one that said, I warned you. You were too late. In that moment, I understood the full scope of the betrayal. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the hidden messages or the stolen trust. It was the way Grace had quietly wormed her way into our home, into our family, and systematically undermined the very bond that I had spent years nurturing. I felt fury, sadness, disbelief, and a strange, hollow sense of loss all at once. The life I had known was gone. The trust I had given freely, the love I had poured into my marriage, had been met with secrecy and lies. And yet, even in that darkness, a small, fierce part of me stirred. I will not let this destroy me entirely. That was the seed of the choice I would have to make. Whether to protect what little remained of my marriage, confront the betrayal openly, or walk away and rebuild on my own terms. The days after I discovered the truth were a haze of whispered arguments, cold silences, and the relentless hum of my own thoughts. I felt like I was walking through a fog, unsure of where the boundaries of my life now lay. Every room in the house seemed different, smaller, colder, tainted by secrets that had quietly accumulated like dust in the corners. David tried to speak to me several times. He would come into the kitchen while I was washing dishes, leaning against the counter, his eyes full of guilt and half-formed apologies. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said once, voice low and almost pleading. But I couldn't meet him. How could I? I could barely meet my own reflection in the mirror without seeing betrayal staring back at me. Grace, on the other hand, continued to move through the house with unnerving ease. She cooked meals, helped with laundry, even tucked the children into bed, all with the same calm, almost perfunctory cheerfulness that had once felt comforting. It now felt like a deliberate show, a performance meant to remind me that she had, in a way, already won. I realized I couldn't confront them both at once. Not yet. Not while my emotions were raw, while every glance and word still threatened to cut me open again. I needed a plan. Not revenge, not theatrics, just clarity and control. The first step was gathering evidence. I started keeping a quiet journal, noting times, dates, and small inconsistencies in their stories. Receipts, messages, and overheard conversations were carefully documented. I didn't want to rely solely on memory. I needed irrefutable proof if I ever decided to confront them publicly or involve other family members. I also started paying closer attention to David's patterns, the times he left the house for work, the emails he received in secrecy, the subtle way his tone changed whenever Grace was near. Each small detail, once ignored, now became a piece of the puzzle. And every piece confirmed what I feared most. This wasn't a minor indiscretion. It was deliberate, ongoing, and deeply entwined in our family's daily life. One evening, I found myself standing in the living room, watching Grace and David from the doorway. They were laughing softly over a shared joke, leaning closer than two people who were merely in-laws should. The sight made my chest tighten, my stomach coil with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I wanted to run from the house to escape the suffocating weight of what was happening around me. But I couldn't. I had to see it clearly, face it, understand it. So I confronted David in a quiet, controlled moment. "I need to know the truth," I said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Everything. No more hiding, no more whispers. This ends tonight." He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward Grace, who had quietly retreated to the kitchen. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to hurt you." "Handle it?" I repeated, my voice rising just slightly. "Do you know what this has done to me? To our children? To everything we built?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down, shame etched into every line of his face. I realized then that words alone would not suffice. Evidence would. Proof would. Clarity would. I decided to limit interactions in the house. Grace would stay, but I would keep distance. Meals became silent affairs, with polite conversation carefully maintained for the sake of the children. Nights were the hardest, lying awake in our bedroom, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on me, while the faint laughter of the adults in the next room haunted the edges of my mind. Yet even in this storm, I noticed something stirring within me. A quiet, unshakable resolve. I would not let their deception define me. I would confront it, navigate it, and emerge intact, even if that meant doing it alone. I began planning small, controlled actions, subtle questions, observations, careful record-keeping. I asked David about certain payments, noting how he hesitated before answering. I followed minor inconsistencies in Grace's stories, piecing together timelines and interactions. Each small revelation was a blow, yes, but also a spark. Proof that I could see clearly, that I was reclaiming control of a life that had been quietly commandeered by deceit. One night, I caught them again, in a moment of unguarded closeness. It wasn't dramatic, not at first glance, just a soft brush of hands, a shared smile. But I recognized it immediately for what it was. Intimacy meant to exclude me. a quiet encroachment on a marriage that had once felt safe. I stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "Enough," I said. "No more hiding. No more whispers. I want the truth. All of it." For the first time, they both looked startled, as if the spell had been broken, as if I had been invisible until that moment. Grace's smile faltered and David's face paled. And in that silence, I realized something important. I held the power now. The choice was mine. To expose, to confront, to protect, or to walk away. It wasn't revenge I sought, not in the dramatic sense. It was clarity, justice, and the chance to reclaim my life from the quiet erosion that had been happening under my nose. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing. I would not let betrayal define my story. I would take action, carefully, deliberately, and with dignity. It wasn't long before the quiet tension in our home began to spill into the wider world. Family gatherings, once safe and warm, became minefields. I realized that the truth, once contained, had a way of seeping out. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes because lies cannot remain perfectly sealed forever. The first crack appeared at a small family dinner. My mother-in-law had come over, as she often did, bringing her usual casseroles and an abundance of advice. Grace, ever the perfect hostess in front of others, smiled and served food with a politeness that felt almost theatrical. But the atmosphere was fragile. I noticed the small glances David and Grace exchanged across the table. Quick, anxious, almost furtive. I chose that moment to act with quiet precision. "Mom," I said, voice steady, "there's something I need to tell you about David, and about Grace." Her fork paused midair, eyes narrowing in curiosity. "What is it, dear?" I took a deep breath. "I've discovered that there's been deception, ongoing, hidden, between David and Grace. It's been going on for months, and I think you should know the truth." The room went silent. Even the kids, sensing the shift, froze mid-bite. David's face went pale, his hand hovering over his glass of water. Grace's smile faltered, and for the first time I saw fear flash in her eyes. My mother-in-law's reaction was immediate, a mix of shock and confusion. "Are you serious?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. "Yes," I said firmly. "I have evidence. Receipts, messages, things I've recorded myself. It's all here. I didn't want it to get this far, but the truth cannot remain hidden." The dinner dissolved into chaos. Questions, protests, denials, David tried to explain, stumbling over his words, but no one wanted half explanations. Grace attempted to charm her way through the conversation, offering reassurances and excuses, but the carefully constructed facade cracked under the weight of scrutiny. I stayed calm, even as my emotions threatened to spill over. I realized then that public consequences were inevitable. Lies, when confronted, have a way of forcing their own reckoning. Grace faced immediate judgment, not from me, not out of malice, but because her actions had become undeniable. Family members began to distance themselves, subtly at first, then openly. Invitations that had once flowed freely were now withheld. Casual phone calls went unanswered. David, too, faced consequences, though they were of a different nature. People who had once admired him, friends, colleagues, extended family, now looked at him with skepticism. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. And though I had loved him fiercely, I recognized that the breach was deep and painful, not just for me, but for everyone who had been caught in the orbit of secrecy. Yet even in this upheaval, I found clarity. The moment the truth was public, the tension in the house began to shift. Grace no longer smiled with calculated ease. David no longer avoided my gaze. Both were forced to confront the weight of their choices. And in that confrontation, I found a strange sense of relief. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just relief. The hidden had been revealed. The shadows could no longer linger. I also noticed a shift in myself. For the first time in weeks, I felt a measure of control returning. My home, once infiltrated by deception, now felt more like mine again. if only because the lies had been laid bare. I could walk into a room without wondering what secrets were being whispered behind my back. I could speak my mind without fear of subtle manipulation. The children, as always, were both innocent witnesses and unintentional reminders of what truly mattered. Emma, perceptive beyond her years, asked me one evening as I tucked her into bed, "Mom, is everything going to be okay?" I paused, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly. "We're going to be okay." Sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes hurt. But we can face them. Together, little Leo, on the other hand, asked simpler questions, though no less piercing. "Why was Grace so mean?" he asked, clutching his blanket. I swallowed the lump in my throat, trying to find words that were honest but gentle. "She made choices that weren't kind, Leo. But we don't have to follow her example. We can be better. We can be loving, honest, and strong." The consequences of their actions were not instantaneous or dramatic in a cinematic sense. There were no shouting matches in the streets, no public humiliations. It was quieter, more subtle, but far more effective. Social circles shifted, alliances changed, and both David and Grace had to live with the knowledge that their choices had tangible, irreversible consequences. And yet, I noticed something remarkable within myself, a sense of resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. The betrayal, as painful and shocking as it had been, forced me to examine my own boundaries, my own strength, and my own capacity for forgiveness. Not for them, but for me. I realized that justice wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about exposing or shaming. It was about reclaiming my own life, asserting my dignity, and setting the tone for how I would allow myself to be treated in the future. In the days that followed, I focused on small, deliberate actions to restore a sense of normalcy. I spent evenings cooking with the kids, going on walks, and reclaiming spaces in the house that had once felt charged with tension. I learned to assert boundaries with David, quiet, firm, unyielding. And I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about understanding it, learning from it, and moving forward without letting it define me. Even Grace, once so seemingly untouchable in her quiet manipulations, began to fade from the edges of our lives. Invitations to family events were withheld politely but firmly. Conversations became minimal, transactional, and devoid of the warmth she had once used to insinuate herself into our home. The consequences were subtle but inescapable, a reflection of the quiet truth that deception cannot thrive indefinitely. And through it all, I discovered an unexpected gift: clarity. The ability to see relationships for what they truly were, to discern intentions, and to recognize the difference between love that nurtures and love that undermines. It was painful, yes, but transformative. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It was a quiet, slow process, like the soft thawing of ice under the morning sun. At first, it felt almost impossible. Every familiar corner of the house, every shared memory with David, was tinged with the shadow of betrayal. Trust, once fractured, does not simply repair itself overnight. But slowly, deliberately, I began to reclaim pieces of my life. The first step was establishing boundaries. Grace no longer held a place in our daily routines, and her visits became infrequent and strictly supervised. I realized that forgiveness did not require proximity, and that protecting myself and my children was paramount. The house, once heavy with tension, gradually felt lighter. I began to notice the small comforts I had taken for granted: the aroma of morning coffee, the warmth of sunlight spilling across the living room, the quiet laughter of Emma and Leo as they built forts and played board games. I also began to confront my feelings about David, slowly untangling love from betrayal, forgiveness from trust. There were moments when anger flared, when I remembered the whispered lies, the secret smiles, the stolen trust. But I reminded myself that anger could coexist with clarity, that one could acknowledge pain without letting it dominate every thought. We began couples counseling, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. David had to face the truth of his actions, and I had to confront the emotional wreckage left behind. The sessions were raw and honest. Tears flowed. sometimes from him, often from me. I forced him to acknowledge the choices he had made and to understand that our family's healing depended on transparency, accountability, and a willingness to change. Gradually, small steps built momentum. David began to communicate openly, sharing his schedule, his thoughts, even his fears. I listened, cautious but hopeful. Trust, I realized, is not a switch to be turned on or off. It is cultivated, carefully and consistently, through action and accountability. Meanwhile, I also focused on my own growth. I returned to hobbies I had set aside: painting, reading, long walks alone in the park, activities that reminded me of my individuality, of the person I was outside the chaos of betrayal. I discovered strength in solitude and a deep, unshakable understanding that I could endure and even thrive despite heartbreak. The children became both my anchor and my joy. Emma would curl up beside me on the couch, asking about small things in her life, and I would listen, cherishing her innocence. Leo would demand that I play with him, insisting on elaborate games with complex rules that only made sense in his imagination. In their laughter and curiosity, I found a sense of continuity, a reminder that life moves forward even when the ground beneath us has shifted. Time, of course, was the ultimate healer. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the sharp edges of betrayal softened. Grace faded into the background of our lives. Her influence diminished not by anger or confrontation, but by the simple reality of consequences. Her choices had separated her from the life she had tried to manipulate. David and I, though forever changed, began to find a new rhythm. It was not the same as before. It could never be. But it was grounded in honesty, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to the family we still had. I discovered that healing doesn't always mean returning to what was. Sometimes it means building something new, something stronger from the fragments of what was broken. I also learned a crucial lesson about human nature. People are capable of both profound love and profound betrayal, often within the same relationships. The measure of a person, and the measure of oneself, is not simply in avoiding betrayal, but in responding to it with dignity, clarity, and strength. Slowly, I stopped walking on eggshells. I reclaimed my spaces, my routines, and my peace. I learned to savor the quiet moments again. A hot cup of tea in the morning, the soft scent of clean laundry, the way sunlight would fall across the living room floor. Even the sound of David's voice, once tinted with secrets, became familiar again. Not fully free of the past, but tempered by honesty and effort. I also forgave, not blindly, not in a way that condoned the betrayal, but in a way that freed me. Forgiveness allowed me to release the tight grip of anger that had threatened to consume me. It was a gift I gave myself, a conscious decision to step out of the shadows of hurt and into the light of self-respect and clarity. By the time a full year had passed since the whisper that started it all, our home had transformed. The tension that had once coiled like a serpent in the corners of every room was gone. Laughter returned, warm and unguarded, echoing off walls that had once seemed suffocating. David and I had rebuilt something, fragile but resilient, and I had discovered a depth of strength I hadn't known existed. Most importantly, I had learned to trust myself again, to listen to my instincts, honor my boundaries, and never let the quiet erosion of deceit go unchecked. I had been tested, betrayed, and hurt. But I emerged not as a victim, but as someone wiser, more aware, and capable of navigating life's most difficult storms with grace. And in the quiet evenings, when the house was calm and the children asleep, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and reflect. The betrayal had changed me, yes, but it had also awakened me to the importance of honesty, vigilance, and self-respect. I was no longer naive, no longer blind to subtle manipulations, but I was also no longer trapped in anger or despair. I had healed in my own way, on my own terms. Looking back, I realized that life often teaches its hardest lessons in whispers and quiet betrayals. The moment I discovered the truth about David and Grace, I felt like my world had cracked in two. But over time, I learned that even when trust is broken, it's possible to reclaim your life. Piece by piece, day by day. Healing isn't instant, and it isn't always neat. There were moments of doubt, sleepless nights, and tears I didn't think would ever stop. But through patience, reflection, and small, deliberate steps, I found clarity. I learned to trust myself again, to set boundaries, and to value honesty above appearances or convenience. Family can bring both love and pain. People we trust the most are sometimes the ones who hurt us the deepest. And yet, even in the face of betrayal, there is hope. Hope in resilience, hope in the strength to rebuild, and hope in the possibility of creating a life rooted in truth and respect. I hope my story reminds you of something vital, that you are stronger than you realize and that healing is always possible, even from the deepest wounds. Life will test you, and people will disappoint you, but how you respond, with dignity, courage, and self-respect, defines your path forward. Would you have found the strength to confront the betrayal and rebuild as I did? Or would you have walked away sooner? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more real-life family stories, where honesty, reflection, and healing take center stage. Sometimes, hearing someone else's journey is the first step toward understanding your own.